Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us is to seek an extension of the state of emergency, which is scheduled to end on May 16, 2021. Mr. Speaker, the current state of emergency, which was passed by resolution of Parliament as statutory instrument number 38 of 2001, extended the state of emergency for an additional period of 90 days from the 11th of February to May 16, 2021. The resolution before us, Mr. Speaker, is to seek the approval of Parliament for an extension of the state of emergency for an additional period of 5 months from May 17, 2021 to October 16, 2021. The purpose of the state of emergency, Mr. Speaker, relates to a declaration that a public emergency has arisen as a result of the occurrence of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, the last time the Prime Minister sought an extension of the SOE, I asked him to explain, to describe, to adumbrate the rationale for having a state of emergency. I wanted the Prime Minister to assist my understanding as to how the SOE would assist our country in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Was it part of an overall architecture, Mr. Speaker? Or if it is a cure, then we should export to many other lands, Mr. Speaker. But to date, the Prime Minister has failed to explain, nor describe, nor define exactly why he needs a state of emergency to impose a curfew for us to deal with the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, it's very simple. The nights are made for sleeping. And most people sleep during the night. During the day, people move around. There is no curfew during the day. So I'm trying to understand the rationale for the curfew. If there is, I'm hoping that today the Prime Minister will assist my understanding. Mr. Speaker, today I asked the Prime Minister what has guided his decision to extend the state of emergency for an additional 5 months. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know whether this decision was guided by the available technical review of the appropriate institutions and agencies that have been established to provide such technical expertise. Further, Mr. Speaker, I am not aware that the National Emergency Management Advisory Committee has met to discuss this matter. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Prime Minister for you, when was the last time that NEMAC met to discuss the COVID-19 situation? Mr. Speaker, based on the numbers I have seen, while St. Lucia has been the worst performer in the OECS in terms of COVID numbers, there has been a trend decline in the COVID statistics recently. The latest statistics I have, Mr. Speaker, gives the following information, and I'll go to May 1st, 2021. Total cases, 4,560. Recoveries, 4,368. Total deaths, 73. Active cases, 113. New cases, 8. Total vaccinated, 24,426. Moreover, based on the press statement that I saw recently, Mr. Speaker, dated April 27, 2021, on the COVID-19 situation update, the following was stated. At this point, we note a decrease in new cases diagnosed, reduced numbers of people with respiratory illnesses, reduced admissions at the respiratory hospital, and reduced numbers accessing care at the clinic. Mr. Speaker, I therefore would want to know whether the decision taken by the Prime Minister is guided by the best available technical decision, noting that I am aware that NIMAC seems to have simply been disbanded by the Prime Minister. And so it seemed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the absence of such documentary information, I am led to believe that this information is guided by political considerations, especially given that we are now very close to a general election and that this government, Mr. Speaker, is acting in desperation mode, seeking to exploit and extort all available means and methods to seek an advantage to gain a victory in the upcoming polls. Mr. Speaker, a state of emergency provides a government with the opportunity to use nefarious methods to gain unfair advantages for the government. A whole spectrum of measures, however oppressive. Mr. Speaker, on June 6, it will be 5 years since this administration has been in office. Yet the Prime Minister is seeking an extension in close proximity to the 5 years to October 16th, 2021. While it seemed to be in keeping with the Constitution, I believe that this government is abusing the patience of the people of this country. This is strange, Mr. Speaker. And the only reason I can understand for this action is purely political. And my colleagues were right when they advanced the argument that we are in the immediate vicinity of 5 years, an election certainly is a consideration. It reminds me of a Creole saying, La lin kui kui, jubawe. Mr. Speaker, all the other protocols are being implemented under the COVID-19 Prevention and Control Act number 9 of 2020. The government can therefore continue to implement the COVID protocols in terms of physical distances, crowd size, opening and closing hours of all institutions, wearing of masks, etc. I would really like to find out, from a technical perspective, Mr. Speaker, how effective is a curfew at such a time, especially when the government is able to regulate COVID-19 protocols effectively with the COVID-19 legislation and the vaccination program is being rolled out. I am convinced, Mr. Speaker, that the government which recently passed a budget clearly indicating that its policies had not worked, as reflected in the fact that the economy had already entered into a recession pre-COVID-19, and that the borrowing requirement and the public debt had reached astronomical levels, is trying to gain an unfair advantage for the upcoming general elections. Mr. Speaker, has the Prime Minister taken time out to reflect and consider the full impact of his political gains on the business community and the wider issues of St. Lucia's economic recovery? Mr. Speaker, the sudden impact of the pandemic and the initial shutdowns and the SOEs to reduce the spread of the virus, a number of small businesses were on the verge of bankruptcy. Small business that generate important jobs and economic activity in St. Lucia were heavily impacted. Extension of the state of emergency, especially those relying on self-employment and micro-enterprises, may disappear because they have less liquidity and buffers to continue. Small business development, Mr. Speaker, plays a key role in creating economic growth, employment, and improved living conditions. Small business, Mr. Speaker, is a provider of goods and services and a generator of the public revenues needed to underpin economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is not a time for curfew to stall our recovery efforts. This is a time to retrofit business procedures to adhere to the COVID-19 protocols, with government measures to support effective stimulus demand, in particular on the consumption side, Mr. Speaker. Specific support measures for most affected sectors and investment plans should also contribute to reactivate the economy. We had to adjust social policies to support those who are impacted most by the crisis, Mr. Speaker, particularly the most vulnerable and those who may have fallen into poverty during the pandemic. Today, we should be debating a package of policies relating to economic recovery, Mr. Speaker. This stage must aim at bringing the economy back on track. Hand in hand with this, Mr. Speaker, is that international cooperation is critical to effectively respond to the health emergency. And given the urgency to reopen the country, given the urgency for us to attract visitors from all over the world, the government should have been in the orbit of the vaccines with absolute alacrity. And in my soundness of judgment, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who's also the Minister for External Affairs, should have been upfront and getting those vaccines even before Dominica and Barbados, because he was in a hurry to have the economy to get back to normalcy, which of course one can readily appreciate, but we must do it in an organized way, Mr. Speaker. Thought that with 2 ministers, I expected greater results, greater efficiency. The member for Kasri South, when he spoke, raised the issue, and the Prime Minister, of course, refuted. But of course, Mr. Speaker, it is something that we would ask questions about, knowing full well that India reached out very early, and I know that, very early, Mr. Speaker. And so, it is only reasonable to infer that given St. Lucia's posture of trying to reopen the economy, which is vital, that they would have been more aggressive in that regard. So when we should be moving, Mr. Speaker, to full recovery, we are imposing the curfew for an additional 5 months. How can we move in that direction when income support was not what it ought to be? Mr. Speaker, and in this regard, I recall the advice of the leader of the opposition at the time to the government. The leader of the opposition cautioned the Prime Minister, both in and out of Parliament, that the sequencing of policy priorities was critical and should be structured to address different policy objectives in responding to the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in the immediate, short, and medium term. He addressed the nation on that issue, Mr. Speaker. Consequently, in the immediate period following the outbreak of the pandemic, the central objective of the government should have been the adoption of measures aimed at avoiding further increases in poverty and avoiding our small business from getting into bankruptcy. But you see, Mr. Speaker, this incompetent UWP administration did a manger cochon with such a simple exercise. Even when the IMF and the World Bank gave us financial support to provide income support for the people who were heavily impacted by COVID-19, they did as they pleased with it. Although The World Bank clearly stated, Mr. Speaker, what the monies were supposed to have been utilized for. And I quote, "This financing aims to provide St. Lucia urgent support to protect lives and livelihoods and strengthen economic resilience." It went further to say, Mr. Speaker, this World Bank financing is expected to help the government enhance the capacity of the health sector and provide short-term relief to the poor, small businesses, and the most severely affected workers. It supports measures to ensure business continuity and save jobs, unquote. Mr. Speaker, when I went through that list, in times past in this House, I listed every single project and only one qualified under this particular provision. I expected, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister and Minister for Finance would have included an income support program for the poor and displaced workers, as well as a program to provide support to small businesses. But regrettably, Mr. Speaker, this was not on the priority list of this administration, who have been beating the chest how great they are and how they're the best managers of the economy. They are beating the chest with a negative 0.1% growth in the economy pre-COVID. When they have borrowed like there is no tomorrow, they should have at least some solid growth in the economy prior to COVID. You instead use the money to finance general election, border control, birth certificate, ICT evolution, national hospital commissioning, and some other projects, Mr. Speaker, that did not meet the criteria. This money, Mr. Speaker, has been allocated for election projects. To make matters worse, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing in the appropriation bill for the poor, the unemployed, and small businesses. The number of citizens in extreme poverty has increased.
Honorable Member, I think you have now stretched stretch your argument. You started very nicely and you tied it up, and I have no issue. But I think right now you've gone.
I'm not hearing you. I'm not hearing you,
Mr. Speaker. Sorry about that. I think right now you have stretched your argument beyond.
And in what way?
Beyond,
in what way, Mr. Speaker?
Beyond the state of emergency. I know how you set it up, so I had no issue with the way you were going. But I think right now you're stretching it.
No, I want to know what exactly am I stretching, Mr. Speaker? Because
you move your focus away now from tying what you've said to the state of emergency and focusing entirely on an election.
No, I'm not talking about electioneering.
No, on the funding and everything.
Yes,
so
that's right.
Yeah, so I'm just saying.
Because the funding was for COVID.
I'm just pulling you back. I'm saying just remain focused. Continue, sir.
No, I thought I was on track. Talking about COVID monies that were given for COVID.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Members opposite had the latitude to talk about all things that were not even of marginal relevance to what we're discussing.
Honorable member. Let's. I try to manage the debate in a manner that member for us, Larry Canner is the member of the head of the command center.
I can read and write, yeah.
Some things are allowed. So all I'm saying to you, remember we're debating the state of emergency.
Yes,
that's all.
That's what I'm debating, Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge and in my soundness of judgment. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe it is proper, as I was discussing the economic matters, to respond to the member for Babuno, who of course went off on a tangent and talk about unemployment. And I just want to indicate to you, Mr. Speaker, or through you, Mr. Speaker, to the member for Babuno, that between 1997 and 2019, 28,102 new jobs were created. Out of these, 21,524 jobs, or 76.6%, were created during the tenure of the St. Lucia Labour Party. Public statistics. And the remaining 6,578 jobs, out of the 6,578 jobs under UWP administrations, that is the member for Kaswis North and the member for Miku South, 75.7% were created under the stewardship of the member for Kaswis North. Only 24.3% were created under the current Prime Minister.
On a point of order, since he is referring to me and is quoting figures, Mr. Speaker, I would really like him to at least quote the source he's getting these figures from.
The public statistics, and I did, and it's in government Hansard. When I went through that analysis last year, and I also went through the analysis this year in the House, where I provided the source. You go on the government website and look at the statistics, the unemployment statistics. And next time you come here, you are free to have a debate with me on that particular matter. But of course, you are in no position to come and talk about you all created so many jobs in this current environment. Now I see nothing else to do because he interrupted me. That the jobs created by the Royalton and the Harbour Club Hotel, because both of those hotels were constructed and came under the St. Lucia Labour Party, and of course were completed when this administration came into office and employed people. I see nothing to do but to minus those jobs from your 2,259. I see nothing else to do. Now, if you provoke me again, I will minus. Mr. Speaker, at this juncture, Mr. Speaker, it is extremely useful, and we are in the realm of debate. It is extremely useful, Mr. Speaker, to allow the member for Labrie to respond to the political arguments that were advanced by members opposite. And they are in the realm of politics themselves. They have canvassers on the ground, and they say, oh, your members opposite have canvassers on the ground. We are in the period for it. Every 5 years, we have a general elections. And all political parties would address themselves very seriously to it. But they keep on bombing us that we are creating tension in this country, Mr. Speaker. We are the ones encouraging people to be violent or to be recalcitrant. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is not involved in trying to inflame the passions of the people of this country. The people of this country are deeply stirred on their own. Well, over the past 5 years, that you have disregarded the development priorities, whilst COVID met a very vulnerable economy, instead of providing income support, many persons have fallen into poverty. You expect them to be in a good mood. When they see the accumulation of wealth in the hands of just a few families, and the majority of them are excluded. They're excluded. The displaced hotel workers, the privatization. You know, the fish cooperation, you know full well the impact it is having on the fishermen, that they are all under the bush selling fish. You know that. You expect them to be in a good mood, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely not. They cannot be in a good mood. But I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is not involved in trying to get people angry. We are preparing to rescue this country, Mr. Speaker. That is what we are using this period of the SOE to do. Because it's a monumental challenge to rescue this economy by virtue of the kinds of contractions that we have in St. Lucia. The worst performer in the OECS. Probably one of the worst in the entire Caribbean, Mr. Speaker. And so we are going to be responsible. We are going to retrofit our political procedures so that we adhere to the COVID-19 protocols. This is what we are going to do. Our priority, our emphasis is on rescuing this country. Look the leader there. Honorable Philip Joseph Pierre. He's the undisputed leader. Undisputed leader. And nobody gave it to him, you know. That I borrow, you know. He earned it. He earned it. We chose him as political leader because he has political experience. And he's competent. He's competent. And you all can call him all sorts of names that you all feel like. But I'll tell you, including Ray Charles. But every time you extend the SOA, he's adding a new verse to the song, Hit the Road Jack, and don't come back here no more, no more, no more. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I yield the floor.